Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Let me first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to recognise the ongoing caring and curation of the land that has been the story of tens of thousands of years, which created knowledge that we're only just really starting to understand and listen to and apply in how we care for country. The New South Wales Government Architect has recently published the Connecting with Country framework, which proposes that built environment projects in New South Wales will move from a human-centred to a country-centred approach, guided by the Aboriginal community who knows best how we care for country. This means a new approach to being guided by community and cultural awareness, and a different approach to how we conceive of a nature-positive city. This emerging approach also brings a contrast between some of the practices adopted from our early European heritage and the living infrastructure that we need to survive and thrive in a harsh and changing climate. So, one of the reasons I was invited to speak today is to set the context for Sydney. And Greater Sydney is defined by its living infrastructure. The image of urbanity perched against the waterways, coastline, national parks and native bushland is what people all over the world associate with Sydney when they think of us. At its best, Sydney gives its residents green places to live, recreate and recover, and blue places to swim and cool down. But do we value that living infrastructure, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but from a health and wellbeing perspective, in terms of climate resilience, and also from a cultural perspective? Nature positive is a term we use to describe a world where nature, species and ecosystems are being restored and regenerated rather than declining. Research from cities around the world shows that nature positive solutions can help cities evolve into a healthier, more resilient way while creating opportunities for social and economic development. Our research has shown that the pathway to a nature-positive Sydney is to better value our living infrastructure. So how do we enable this wider socio and economic value to be embedded in the day-to-day decision-making of communities, business and developers, and government at the local and state level? So let's start with why we should invest in nature. Despite the provision of living infrastructure being elevated as a priority across the city, there's not adequate investment in trees, plants, parks and water bodies, nor the measurement strategies to focus that investment where it's most needed. Here in Sydney, the benefit of a daily connection to nature was so clearly reinforced during the pandemic, where with households getting out to local and national parks in record numbers, and households spending over $2.5 billion just on buying plants. But green cover is not provided equitably across Greater Sydney, and councils have highly variable levels of resourcing dedicated to living infrastructure, planning, delivery and maintenance. Further, there's inequities in our levels of access to living infrastructure across the metropolitan area. Whereas in some parts of Sydney, open space is less than an 800-metre walk, other parts it's more than 2 kilometres. Lack of investment means we miss out on 5 key benefits. So reduced heat and improved air quality. A recent report from Sweltering Cities found that almost 70% of Western Sydney respondents reported feeling unwell on hot days and during heat waves, and 1 in 8 had to seek medical advice because they were unwell in the heat. This diagram shows how climate change is going to increase the number of hot days going from the east of the Sydney where the beaches are across to the west of the Sydney near the mountains. So up to 67 hot days days over 35 degrees in Richmond. So better climate resilience. Climate-related events such as flooding, storms and sea level rise can be mitigated by providing space for intact floodplains, restoring creeks and rivers, mangroves and allowing water to infiltrate. We know this. Studies by Melbourne Water in the Port Phillip Bay catchment have shown the current value of living infrastructure that intercepts water and reduces annual flooding around $340 million a year. Growing bodies of research demonstrates that spending time in nature improves our mental as well as our physical health. So research from the University of Wollongong has shown that adults who live in neighbourhoods where 30% or more of the areas covered by tree canopy had more than 30% lower odds of developing psychological distress. The World Economic Forum's Future of Nature and Business report found that putting cities on a pathway where nature visibly and measurably recovers could create $3 trillion in business opportunities and 117 million jobs by 2030 globally. And yet the impact of climate change, pests and pathogens, which can decimate existing tree canopy and native vegetation, mean that we need to ensure we are planting with biosecurity in mind. And waterways and green spaces can deliver carbon capture, water filtration, stormwater capture benefits within our built-up areas, and recognise also that by actually caring for country, going back to that connecting with country framework, that we can create social, cultural, environmental, and economic system symbiosis that can emerge from a better connected city systems. So how do we realise these benefits? This is the retail stuff, if you like. We know that we can envisage a city abundant with nature, but it has to exist in place. There actually needs to be bits of land, spaces that exist across our city. And there's 10 key images, places across there that represent places for ingenuity and innovation, solutions that can respond to the social, cultural, environmental context. And this is where the policy work happens. We don't need to stray too far from the statistics on urban heat and health and climate resilience and our reliance on biodiversity to know that there's more to do to value our living infrastructure. So let's get into the policy stuff. So we came up with an action plan. There's a much more detailed report here, but I'll see if I can get through it, on what we need to do to better value our living infrastructure. So the first one is really around knowledge. So we know that there's a significant knowledge gap across Australia on how to design, install and maintain biodiverse ecologies in urban environments, challenge that universities and the cities are taking up through various research and education groups. But it's how to bring that together with the application into policy. And that can only happen with an army of skilled researchers, landscape architects, arborists, ecologists, and horticulturists from public and private organisations. And skill development and behaviour change is needed across the market, across engineers, designers, contractors, and facility managers. It's a huge challenge. We've only just begun to learn from First Nations people across Sydney, the Sydney Basin. Organisations like IndigiGrow, which is an Indigenous organisation based here in Sydney, seeks to pass down First Nations knowledge and provide opportunities for the wider community to engage in that knowledge about the wide range of benefits of native plants, for example. We think there's an opportunity for a Centre for Urban and Indigenous Knowledge to bring those two kind of ideas together, those two perspectives together, and address those challenges. This might seem obvious, but we need to set clear living infrastructure targets and monitor the progress. New outcome-based targets are needed for living infrastructure, going beyond tree planting or input-based targets, which is how we measure a lot of that today. We've started to measure canopy, vegetation, biodiversity. We've got to push that ahead and really get into more detail about what kind of quality of outcomes we're getting in terms of that measurement and how that links to the investment. Particularly focused on those places that have significant deficits, as I talked about before, in terms of access. Without the targets and the ability to accurately measure them, we have no way of tracking whether that investment is actually improving the relative quality and quantity of living infrastructure and whether that's contributing to the climate resiliency that we need. For example, there's over 2 million private dwellings in Sydney, and the most amount of canopy loss is happening on private land. So the policies and the measurement we need to do needs to cover both public and private land in that respect. So city governments around the world spend significant time and effort identifying and managing built capital assets, buildings, pipes, roads and drains. The same cannot be said about living infrastructure and the valuable services and co-benefits it provides. Living infrastructure inventories are emerging across Greater Sydney, from Campbelltown to the City of Sydney. And we recommend this kind of comprehensive approach where trees and vegetation health assessment are included as part of inventories and living infrastructure management processes, extending to detecting signs of new pest and pathogen incursions. So that's literally being able to monitor each tree and each as an asset, as we do bridges and roads and drains. We also need to unlock the purchasing power of not just state and local government, but also, and we'll get to business, but to drive living infrastructure through capital expenditure and maintenance. So we can do this by making all government procurement require consideration of living infrastructure alternatives to standard approaches. So tender processes might consider a landscape architect to lead the relevant design elements. And we've seen this work in places like Green Square, which is just south of the CBD, not far from here. This approach meant that roads were designed around deep soil plantings, whereas projects like the light rail through the CBD meant that you had smaller trees really squeezed around the infrastructure that was planned first. This one's for you, Sebastian, just to keep you happy. So introducing green factor tools also needed to incentivise living infrastructure and new development. So once targets have been established, the next step is to connect new developments, so approvals of residential, commercial and industrial, to achieving these targets. New development forms part of the opportunity to regenerate and care for our living infrastructure. In London, the Urban Green Factor tool evaluates and quantifies the amount and quality of urban greening that a scheme provides to inform decisions about appropriate levels of greening in new developments. This is being introduced in City of Sydney and City of Melbourne, but not across the city, across Greater Sydney. We need an approach that provides clarity and incentives even to private landowners, including an increase of things like floor space ratio perhaps, and regulations that ensure that any loss of living infrastructure is met with a net positive replacement. The Skyrise Greenery Incentive Scheme in Singapore funds up to half the installation costs of rooftop and vertical greenery and has assisted in greening more than 110 existing buildings in Singapore by retrofitting them with extensive green roofs, edible gardens, recreational rooftops, and green walls. We think there's an opportunity, maybe not in the next budget, for a New South Wales Government Living Infrastructure Fund to cover some of those upfront capital costs and create these incentives for the ongoing maintenance and reap the benefits that we're seeing across the city. So really targeted funding on how you can actually achieve some of these benefits with specific built environment opportunities. We've seen places like Darramoo House, which is part of the Barangaroo development in the Sydney CBD, that's demonstrating things like stormwater retention and biodiversity improvements and rooftop solar performance just in a single building. And this has huge benefits if replicated across the city. And adopt a framework for valuing living infrastructure in major projects. So in parallel with new development approvals, living infrastructure benefits should be a mandatory part of all business cases, including valuing green and blue living infrastructure as alternatives to grey infrastructure, and the economic quantification of the benefits to air quality, reduced heat, health and biodiversity. Parramatta Light Rail has built on international precedent and taken an award-winning approach to replacing asphalt and concrete with grass shrubs, effectively greening 1.3 kilometres of tracks and bringing additional greening into the city. There's a picture up here. Imagine if we embedded that kind of thinking into all of our green infrastructure projects. So Sydney starts, at my 1 minute, perfect. Sydney starts from a position of strength, a city well-renowned for its natural environment. But with a burgeoning city, a changing climate and growing knowledge of how vulnerable our communities and living infrastructure are becoming, there's no room for complacency. We need a major shift in policy, practice and investment to move towards a nature-positive city. We know that by investing in living infrastructure, we can realise significant economic, social health and climate resilience benefits and address inequity across the city. The opportunity to restore nature is in our hands, from backyards and balconies, streets to schools, rooftops to rivers and railways, and from green walls to greenfield development areas. And by better engaging communities and First Nations knowledge, setting targets that go beyond trees and open space, applying asset management expertise to nature rather than just roads and drains, and ensuring new property and infrastructure projects are nature positive through incentives, funding and procurement practices, and changes to business case methodology. Sydney can be a nature positive city. We believe that this research provides a clear plan to value our living infrastructure as a pathway to realising that goal. Thank you.
I think we have time for one question.
Took up all the time talking.
Thank you.
So thank you for the presentation. We have a lot of scientists. Thank you for the presentation. We have a lot of scientists coming to Sydney, and I guess one of the main questions that we have from very specific community, you're producing the science. How do we actually make sure it gets translated in the policy? And there's always a question about what are the key barriers that you see being on the other side. But is it about the training? Is it about producing new elements that you still think are not figured out? What do you think are the key aspects that a community like this can provide so we can see the policy is being implemented on a larger scale?
Yeah, it's not an easy question. So I work for the Committee for Sydney. So we're a not-for-profit think tank, an advocacy organisation. So we're always looking for what is the opportunity to take science recommendations and apply that into a particular policy mechanism. So something that the government can change, whether that's at local or state government level, change a policy, introduce a funding mechanism, etc., to actually change behaviour. So it makes it really easy when the research gives us the statistics, the really kind of drawing out what the kind of big picture is, the specific changes that are happening as a result of climate around urban heat, for example, and actually say, look, this is the problem and this is how it's going to get worse. And therefore, the policy recommendations can then say, this is how we can change that trajectory. So it's really for us is to find the mechanism and for, I guess, for researchers or making the undertaking that research to really make it clear what the finding is, I suppose, in a really kind of, I've drawn out a few into our research to actually say, if we do this differently, this is the change we can make, and if we don't, this is the problem that's going to be drawn out. There's a much longer paper if anybody's interested in reading it in their spare time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.